and the current president wants to be in the war, and the president running against him doesn't want to be in the war, so the terrorists go to Madrid, to the subway system, and they blow up all these subways, and they kill people indiscriminately, and then they have the election, and guess who the people elected? The person who didn't want to be in the war. And Spain withdrew from what we call the axis of the helpful. An act of terrorism, attacking civilians to get them, we say, to dissuade or get their government to get out of the conflict. Terrorism is designed to do that. So on Thursday, we'll talk in more detail about terrorism and the effect it has on people. So there's a distinction. When terrorists attack a military target, it's an act of war. Mano a mano, military against military. I don't care what they're wearing. But when they attack civilians, it becomes an act of terrorism. Civilians don't have a defense. And the intent of the terrorist act is to get the civilians to convince their government to stop the war with the terrorists. And when they're successful, fine. They tried to do it here on 9/11, and it did not work. And we went to war with them. So questions about the difference between the two? Terrorism, military, both violent. Military to military, an act of war. Terrorists against civilians, an act of terror. Okay? Which leads to an interesting question. When we left the Crown, when we fought in the colonial war, if you Google old British newspapers, they referred to us as terrorists. We were just fighting against the king, but they referred to us as terrorists. There's a group of people called the Basques, B-A-S-Q-U-Es, between France and Spain in the Pyrenees Mountains, and they want their own freedom. Remember we talked about tribes? They're their own people. We haven't given them their freedom, and they're labeled terrorists. The Irish Republican Army used to go into London and blow up civilians, trying to get their freedom for Ireland. We label them terrorists. They attack civilians. At the end of World War II, when we dropped the 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was no military target left. Jimmy Doolittle and his bombers had already taken care of that. So we put 136,000 civilian lives at risk. Purposely targeted civilians in the hope that the Japanese would stop the war. Now, it fits the definition. I'm not going to call us terrorists. I mean, we tried to save 4 million lives at the end of the war. So we have to be careful how we interpret this. The British, at the end of their war with Germany, were so tired of London being bombed by B-2 rockets, we put together with them a aircraft armada, and they were loaded with what we call fire bombs, not high explosive HEP bombs, but fire bombs. We picked one of the windiest days, and we flew over Hamburg and Dresden, and there was no military target left. We had taken care of that too. And so we dropped these incendiary bombs on Dresden and Hamburg. Dresden, most of the buildings back then were made of wood and brick. The wood burns with fire, and we created what's called a firestorm. You ever see the movie Backdraft, where you can suck the oxygen literally out? Well, that's what happened that night. At least the people in Dresden had a lake, and they all ran for the lake thinking, well, water will protect us. It didn't. There was such a firestorm, it sucked the oxygen out. Literally, I don't want to be graphic, it literally burnt people up from the inside out. And they were only civilians. And the British did it intentionally, and we helped them. It was called retribution. It was revenge, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Sometimes in war you can justify that. Did that make us terrorists? Well, it fits the definition again. Did that make us terrorists? I'm not willing to say it did. People got sick and tired of what the Germans did, especially at the end of the war when we saw what they really did to people and how barbaric they were. So it's important that we understand a couple of things out of this, people. We have to understand we have a right to defend ourselves. What are we defending? Freedom. Are we ever justified in surrendering essential freedom to gain a little temporary safety? Here comes Ben saying, that's a bad road to go down. Well, we've been down that road. It's not the first time. During World War II, we took U.S. citizens of Japanese descent. We put them in internment camps. We took German citizens of Americans of German descent. We put them in internment camps. We took Italians. Most people don't know that. We were at war with 3 countries, Italy, Germany, and Japan. We took Italians and put them in internment camps in Star City in Texas. And at the end of the war, we let the Italians out. Pizza, 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 pizza. And we let the Japanese out. They kept the Germans for 2 more years. After we saw what the Nazis did, we weren't sure what the American neo-Nazi party meant here. And so we kept, these are American citizens who, as far as we know, did nothing wrong. We limited their freedoms. They weren't concentration camps, they were internment camps. We limited their freedoms, and we feel like we justified it. So, freedom is what's at stake. Ben says we need to be very cautious about how we protect that freedom. You don't surrender or suspend your essential liberties. If you do, you're going down the wrong road. So Ben's important to remember. Just war theory, how we get into a just war theory, preemptive war, the difference between war and terrorism. And that gives you enough information to do well on your quiz. 100% people. I'm expecting 100%. And when we get to the thing on the lecture on terrorism, you'll see why it's just more nuts and bolts when we get to that. So any questions for me? You can't go yet.